All right, well, it's 4 o'clock, so we are going to get started. Everyone can trickle in, so it's an free entry webinar, so we'll get started. So for those who don't know me, my name is Emily Cormier. I am the Sustainability Coordinator at the City of Sault Ste. Marie. And I'm very pleased to host today's webinar regarding planning for Sault Ste. Marie, parking reform, and sustainable development. We've got some terrific speakers today that we're just so thrilled could make the time to join us. So I'm just going to go through a couple of opening remarks and introductions, and then we'll turn it over to our very anticipated guests. We've had about 71 people register for this webinar. Not too sure if they'll all attend, but we are recording it, so we'll be sure to get it out for those who couldn't make it today. So just, I've got to switch my slides here. There we go. So just a couple of guidelines. Because this is a webinar, please ask any questions by using the Q&A function in the bottom of your Zoom screen. Oops, my slides are jumping. And if you want to speak, please raise your hand and I will unmute you. I ask that you please keep your comments brief and to the end, and try to keep them to a minute or less so that we can have as many questions and comments as possible shared. So for our agenda today, like I said, I'm going to be doing a few opening remarks and some introductions to our speakers. And our speakers today are Laura Flaherty, as well as Brent Tadarian. Laura is from the City of Kingston and Brent is from Urban Works. We will then open it up for some questions and answers and talk about some closing remarks. I'd also like to just put a shout out here to the City of Sault Ste. Marie's Environmental Sustainability Committee, as well as our planning department, who are responsible for bringing this webinar and presenting it today. So thank you to the committee, as well as to the Sault Ste. Marie Planning Department. I'd also like to just do a quick pitch regarding the Environmental Sustainability Committee. We are quite new. We were established in 2021. And this is a committee of council at the City of Sault Ste. Marie that supports projects that relate to environmental sustainability. They oversee the review and implementation of the City of Sault Ste. Marie's greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan. They also review and recommend funding applications to the City of Sault Ste. Marie's Community Development Fund. And this fund funds projects that reduce emissions, encourage energy efficiency, water quality improvement, regreening, waste reduction, and active transportation. Local nonprofits as well as city departments are eligible to apply. So if you have any questions about that fund, please reach out to me. The committee also supports initiatives that promote environmental sustainability and conservation of the local natural environment. And they create and highlight opportunities like the one today for the general public to learn about and advocate for climate change mitigation and encourage outreach in environmental manners, specifically education. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Laura Flaherty. She's an MCIP RPP. She is the project manager in planning services for the City of Kingston, co-author of The Power of Parking, and was the lead on the city's new zoning bylaw project approved in April of this year. Laura has a background for working for a development lawyer in Toronto before starting with the City of Kingston. And Laura finds innovative and creative policy solutions to problems that require strategic thinking. Thank you, Laura, so much for attending today. Our second speaker is Brent Tadarian. Brent is a national and international thought leader on better cities and a leading global practitioner in city planning, urban design, transportation, and advanced urbanism. He advises cities, governments, and best practice developers across North America and around the world. Brent's establishment of Tadarian Urban Works in 2012 followed 6 years of significant achievement as Chief City Planner for Vancouver and 6 years as a transformative planning leader in Calgary. He started his career
Emily, please don't read that whole bio. It'll put everybody to sleep. I think that's a great introduction. Thank you.
Good enough then. All righty. Okay, well, you can all read it all, and you've also seen the registration and have probably read it on your own. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I will also apologize. I wanted to do a land acknowledgement before I began this meeting, so I will do so now. I'd like to acknowledge with respect that though we are gathered virtually, I'm speaking to you today from Robinson Huron Treaty Territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, home of Garden River First Nation, Batchewana First Nation, and the Métis Nation of Ontario. I also acknowledge that this area is historically known as Bawading. The City of Sault Ste. Marie recognizes the importance of our relationship with the Indigenous community as we move forward in the spirit of reconciliation. Now, I believe we can go forward in a good way. So without further ado, I turn this over to Laura.
Thanks, Emily. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Fabulous, thank you. So I was going to start by introducing myself and Brent, but I think Emily did a great job at doing that. So thank you for inviting us this evening to talk to you about the power of parking, a new parking paradigm for Kingston, which is a piece of work that Brent and I co-authored as part of the city's new zoning bylaw project. My role with the City of Kingston is as a project manager and planning services. So I'm a registered professional planner, and under the planning policy projects, I kind of am focused on some of the larger, more major policy pieces like the city's new zoning bylaw. So I think, Emily, in your slideshow, you broke out the time between Brent and I, but we've since decided that we would be approaching this presentation a little bit differently than normal. So we are going to do a little bit more of a conversational style throughout the presentation, where Brent and I will both share on both slides. So we're not going to stick exactly to the time frame that you had in your presentation.
Sounds good.
Okay.
And just
So,
in the spirit of that, my involvement with the City of Kingston is that I've been an ongoing advisor to the city since beginning of 2018. So I advise the city on everything relating to planning and transportation. It's a very open-ended relationship. And Laura was actually working on the zoning bylaw and parking for a while before the chief planner asked me to assist her. So it's indicative of the kind of interaction that I have with the city. They ask me to get involved wherever they think I can help. And that's certainly, I think it's fair to say, Laura, this has probably been the most interesting opportunity to work with Kingston of everything I've done for them since 2018. And that's saying a lot, because we've done a lot of cool stuff.
I'd agree with that, Brent. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the City of Kingston, I'll just give you a very brief primer. It's a smaller city in Eastern Ontario. It's about 3 hours from Toronto, Montreal, 2 hours from Ottawa. It's located at the junction of Lake Ontario, the Rideau Canal, and the St. Lawrence River. It's home to a military base, many hospitals, large employers, Queen's University, RMC, St. Lawrence College. It has a permanent population of about 132,000 and an additional 30,000 when we actually factor students into that. In recent years, the strategic priorities of Kingston are very similar to many municipalities across Canada, with a definite focus on climate action, housing affordability, economic development, the health of our residents, and alternative transportation. So the main project that initiated this discussion about parking was exactly as Brent spoke to. It's about the new zoning bylaw. So as a project manager on the new zoning bylaw, I think it's really important to understand the context and the timeline for that project to really understand how we were able to arrive at where we did with the power of parking. So the new zoning bylaw project started back in 2011 in phase one. So it predated me ever working for the city. And phase two, we had an outside consultant who actually prepared the first draft of the new zoning bylaw as really a consolidation of the existing zoning bylaws. So the project was put on hold for a number of years for a number of different reasons. And we really started back up in the third and final phase in September of 2020 with, a lot of renewed vigor and a completely different perspective and approach to how the new zoning bylaw should be approached. So we did the final phase entirely in-house. Obviously, Brent assisted with the co-authoring the parking discussion paper, but otherwise it was done entirely by City of Kingston planning staff and obviously our internal colleagues. And as you can see, a lot of time passed between the initial phases of the project and the final phase, which really allowed a lot of things to change in the political climate and in our understanding of the connection between land use planning policies and our broader strategic priorities. So it really became clear to us that we not only had a huge opportunity, but actually a responsibility to tweak and rethink many of the elements of the project beyond just a consolidation of the past practices.
And can I just add, I think it's important to probably say that at the time, Kingston was going through a major culture change in the context of not just its planning approach, but frankly, everything that City Hall was doing. It had very good leaders, new leaders that were relatively new in their position, including the chief planner and ultimately the new city manager. And so they wanted to do things very differently. But to be perfectly candid, their policy house was a shambles. They had, and I'm going to be blunt because Laura probably doesn't want to say something like this, and that's fair. But when I was first brought in, one of the observations was that almost everything the city wanted to do, their policy house was standing in the way of. It either didn't accommodate what they wanted to do and sometimes even prohibited it. And that was from the official plan right to the zoning bylaw. So when Laura takes over the zoning bylaw, for example, the pre-existing statement is that all we need is a consolidation of the zoning bylaws of the previous municipalities. And that was indicative of the fundamental wrong thinking that was in place before these new leaders came in place. And thankfully, and I'm a big student and fan of changing municipal culture, these new leaders had no tolerance for just continuing an approach that was leading to failure. So there was an open-mindedness to reconsider every sacred cow, if you will, every previous direction, every previous assumption, and ask the question, is this working for us or is it not? And so the realization that this direction we were going to just consolidate former rezonings is kind of an example of what City Hall was doing in almost every portfolio. There was a willingness to say, no, that's wrong, and we're going to do it right now, even though there was a great deal of momentum built up towards, just continuing the wrong way of doing it. And, that sounds like something that should be obvious, but I can tell you from my practice working across Canada and North America and the world, it's actually relatively rare for a city hall to be willing to challenge all of its previous decisions based on the recognition that they were not working and that there was a fundamental disconnect between those previous decisions and what council's actual stated goals and objectives were, not the least of which was radically and dramatically addressing the climate emergency.
So one of the major topics that clearly needed to have a rethink was parking. Obviously, we wanted to really connect the dots between parking and the major city priorities and objectives by, putting together a discussion paper that was really different from what we had done as planning staff before, and pretty much very different than what anyone has done as a parking study before. So we really framed the discussion paper as a call to action and provided some pretty blunt observations about the real parking problems that our parking policies have created in our community. And in doing so, it allowed us to lay out some potential solutions and really connect those solutions to our strategic priorities and objectives. And, at the same time, we tried to get out in front of some of the issues that we knew would be concerns from the community. So while we wanted to significantly reduce the number of parking spaces that are being provided, we wanted to ensure that accessible parking spaces are still being provided. And we put a lot of thought into proactively addressing the potential outcomes of releasing a fundamentally changed perspective on parking.
Right. The idea of using parking as an example of how we were going to rethink everything was quite deliberate, because parking, it's like potholes. It's one of those things that everybody's got a strong opinion on, but nobody really very few people spend a lot of time thinking about how incredibly powerful parking regulations are in the achievement of almost everything the city wants to achieve and all of its stated goals, because parking is perceived as such a technical thing, such a mind-numbingly boring thing. And so regulatory and based on this black box of technical expertise that no normal people understand. So it was quite deliberate that we wanted to blow a big hole right into the to the previous thinking of how we were going to tackle parking. Is someone laughing at me back there, Laura?
No, it's my 3-year-old crying for me. I'm sorry, everyone.
Mine's watching Paw Patrol. So imagine taking this thing that is the most boring thing that city halls can talk about and trying to actually not just make it accessible, but actually interesting, persuasive, sexy almost, and do it in a way where people would be interested in the conversation, interested in reading the documentation. We actually set the goal for ourselves of writing the most interesting municipal staff document on planning ever written. And, you know, whether or not we met that or not is irrelevant. That's the tone we wanted to set for this work, and particularly this communication. So for all of you who are interested in this, you can download, I think the Sault Ste. Marie website, you can download the document, The Power of Parking. And if you don't want to read the whole thing, literally just read the introduction from Paige Agnew, the commissioner, and myself, because it sets the tone for the whole thing. And once you read it, you immediately get a sense that, wow, this is going to be a very different planning document, parking document than you've been used to reading. And that really quite deliberately set the tone for every media strategy we had, every community conversation strategy we had, because unlike many planning exercises where city halls actually hope a lot of people don't pay attention because, you know, that might lead to controversy, we deliberately wanted everybody talking about parking, but we wanted them to be talking about parking with a fundamentally new understanding of what the real parking problem was, i.e. too much parking in our city, and how fixing the parking approach could really transform the way that the city addresses its goals. And this last bullet that Laura has discussed, the proactively addressing key issues, I want you to understand the strategy of that, because certainly in my work around the world, I've seen many cases where parking or car access or such has blown up politically because there hasn't been a good job done of proactively considering what the third rails are going to be, what the landmines are going to be. And an example of that is you can't have a conversation about parking without proactively thinking about what it would mean to accessible parking for the disabled and such. So rather than waiting for that controversy to happen, which is what I've seen so many cities do, we proactively looked at everything various cities around the world had done, came up with a smart strategic strategy, proactively talked about it with the accessibility groups, and made sure that they were on side from day one. And so it never became the controversy that it becomes in most city processes around parking.
And as Brent said, you know, when we did the discussion paper, we knew that we had to reach out about this discussion paper in a different way than we normally do, because we really did want it to be a call to action, and we really did want that, you know, that public conversation, and not have something that, you know, people don't even realize is happening in their community, which is often what happens with a lot of, you know, planning policy matters, which take a lot of time and energy for members of the public to participate in. So we reached out to as many stakeholders as we could who we thought would have a direct interest in the topic from a variety of different perspectives. We had engagement sessions with them. We had a media briefing that was scheduled the day that the document was released, and we had a number of newspaper articles that were written about the work that we did. We had blog posts published, a local sustainability podcast interview, and it all culminated in the public meeting where we did present the work for the first time. What did the power of parking do differently? So it really was fundamentally a different planning document that looked at the real parking problem from the perspective of climate action, housing affordability, equity, urban design, and public spaces. It really focused on those elements and the impact that the provision of too much parking has on all of those matters. So traditionally people think that the parking problem is that there isn't enough parking where they want to go. And fundamentally we wanted to shift the narrative on its head basically, and say that there is actually too much parking in most circumstances. And it's often due to the outdated parking policies that we have as municipalities. So in this presentation, we're obviously going to focus on the environmental and climate change elements of the power of parking discussion paper, but there are direct connections and consequences on all of these other matters that we do talk about in detail, and they all influence the initial options and our ultimate recommendations about the parking. So we are just going to focus on the climate and environment, but I don't want these other pieces to be lost in this discussion. When most people think about climate action, they tend to think about emission reduction through the lens of, electric vehicles and trees and solar panels and alternative energy or green building requirements. So I've included a quote here from a comment I received on the new zoning bylaw project. And I think it reflects a lot of the conversations that we had on the zoning bylaw and specifically the power of parking. And I think it's really important for us to connect the dots and to continue to connect the dots between land use, transportation, and the climate emergency. So we've done this throughout the power of parking conversation, and we've often had to reconnect the dots in our discussions with people. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to flat out connect the dots, like right up front. Climate action is about the layout of cities. How close do people live to where you work, shop, and play? How many kilometers of roads needs to be built in your neighborhood to get to all of the houses? How many kilometers of sewer pipes and all of the infrastructure that goes underneath the roads and sidewalks need to be built? How many extra kilometers of gas are going to be burned by garbage trucks and snow plow removal vehicles and the cars that people are driving to and from their houses every single day? How many kilometers of infrastructure needs to be replaced annually or every 10 years within those roads? So there is a direct connection between how we plan our cities, how we move around our cities, and how much of an impact we have on the environment. And I think that connection is often lost when we're talking about climate action, and that land use isn't at the forefront of people's heads. So when we talk about parking and its direct connection to the climate emergency, there are really two main direct connections. And first is obviously the transportation that's associated with the parking. So the parking spaces themselves aren't generating the ongoing GHG emissions on a daily basis. So we'll get into the GHG of the construction on the next slide, but they do encourage vehicles to move freely from one area of the city to the other. So in Kingston, the community GHG inventory identified that 36% of the GHG emissions come from the transportation sector. So a really large percentage of that is connected to private automobiles and how they move around the city. So again, this is connected to parking since the availability of parking spaces actually encourages the use of cars, but it's also connected obviously to the way that we plan and move around our cities. The second thing to consider when we're talking about connecting parking specifically to the climate emergency are the construction materials that inherently go into parking spaces. So, asphalt, concrete, steel, the traditional materials that are used in surface parking spaces and parking structures. The mining, production, processing, and transportation of those materials contribute a huge portion of the global GHG emissions and really contribute to the climate emergency. So I think the statistic is that the concrete industry contributes about 5% of global emissions, and the steel industry is another 5% of the global emissions. So when you're talking about parking requirements are often, a minimum number of spaces that are required for any given land use. And within that minimum number of spaces, there are also design constraints and considerations. So the picture in front of you is actually a really great indicator that, a lot of real estate goes into designing and laying out parking spaces in a way that they can be functional on a property, which requires a huge number of construction materials that inherently contribute to a huge percentage of the GHG emissions globally.
One of the reasons why we made sure to connect the dots with many things, and Laura's explained that we're going to focus on the climate emergency today. But as we all know, there's many people who are very motivated by addressing the climate emergency, and sadly, there are some people who are not. But those other folks tend to have other things that motivates their thinking, and affordability is particularly important, whether that's municipal affordability in the context of public costs and taxes, or your personal affordability in terms of your how much it costs you to run a household, including owning cars and paying for gas and such. And so, just as much as we talked about climate emergency and connected the dots in a completely unassailable way about that, the other one we really talked about, Laura, probably more than others in the list, was the affordability piece, because that Kingston had a mayor's task force on housing affordability. It was a high profile issue. We wanted to bring the cost of housing down, but also the cost of living down. And we had this conversation about how parking actually not only induces driving, it also induces car ownership, and how many cars a household perceives itself to need. And how to have that conversation in the context of making sure at the same time we're making other alternatives more attractive, walking, biking, and transit, and car share as an opportunity, which eventually came out of all of this. So I only interject because there's probably some people, sadly, still listening to this webinar who are thinking, why so much emphasis on climate emergency? Well, if you're not motivated by climate emergency, you're probably motivated by equity. And if you're not motivated by equity, you're probably motivated by heritage preservation. And if you're not motivated by that, you're probably sure as heck motivated by money, because most people are, whether that's public money or individual and household money. And we made the case for all of those things, that you simply could not have a credible conversation about mitigating climate change, mitigating household affordability challenges, et cetera, without addressing parking. And we did our work. We showed our math, as my fourth grade math teacher said, always used to say. So it right up front, it made it very hard to have a conversation that sort of rebutted this, because we had our receipts, as the kids say. We showed our work and made sure that people got the strength of the argument before we even had the debate, if you see what I mean.
And obviously within the power of parking, we really identified the need to really turn our parking policies upside down. So shifting the focus from the need to provide parking spaces for cars as the top priority to focusing on the need to providing spaces and infrastructure for bikes and all other alternative modes of transportation. And really the need to better support transit and leverage our investments in that infrastructure in our parking policies. So transit and active transportation were really the foundation of the work, but we also saw it as an opportunity to create a new alternative mode in Kingston. So the discussion paper really focused on supporting the creation of a citywide car sharing system that would, help to complement both the active transportation and transit systems in the city for trips that might not necessarily be convenient via those two modes. And hopefully giving residents the option to get a car share membership instead of buying a car, or even just a second car. So really looking to establish that broader car sharing network was directly connected with the AT and transit priorities that we had identified.
And one of the reasons for that is because the experience in other cities has been that even if once you've had success in mode shift from car use to walking, biking, and transit, you can definitely see a reduced number of car trips, but you don't necessarily always see a reduction in car ownership, because people tend to still own a car for whatever reason. I call it the excuse of driving to the IKEA or driving to your cottage or something like that. And you have this perception, or just the monthly grocery store to Costco or to a bigger grocery store. And so there's a perception that even if you don't use your car very often, because walking, biking, and transit is an attractive option, you still own it. And what we've seen in other cities is that car sharing, in addition to, of course, things like renting a car and such, or Uber, car sharing is often the threshold or the catalyst that gets you from low car use to low car ownership. So there's a specific nexus between that and reduced parking need. So we wanted to connect the dots between how to reduce car ownership and the need for car ownership, or the attractiveness of car ownership, at the same time as we're reducing parking. And if you're going to do that, you have to include the conversation of not only walking, biking, and transit in your parking conversation, but also car share in your parking conversation. That was a new conversation, car share for Kingston. There's often a perception that smaller cities don't have car share or can't do car share. And Kingston, frankly, wants to be the city that proves that mythology wrong. And so there's a very interesting conversation going on about a municipally led car share system, which is part of the larger strategy for how we're doing parking, active transport, et cetera.
So ultimately, we really positioned the discussion paper as a series of initially favored options. And the intent of this approach was really to create space for that public feedback. We were identifying problems and some potential solutions, but we recognize that oftentimes through the planning process and the public participation in it, you receive a lot of valuable feedback. So we wanted to ensure that we had an opportunity to revisit those initially favored options based on the feedback through the process before we made any formal staff recommendations within the context of the zoning bylaw. So the initially favored options that we had actually laid out in the power of parking are slightly different than what we ended up with in the final version of the new zoning bylaw. So we'll just kind of walk through what the main favored options were in our power of parking and then where we ended up within the next few slides.
And by the way, if you're thinking that's a strange title, initially favored options, that's because we wanted to make a strong case for a set of new ideas, but we didn't feel ready to call them recommendations yet. And so we asked ourselves, well, what should we call them then? We don't want to just float them out there as options because frankly, we thought these options had a lot of strong logic to them and strong support to them. So options sounded too weak. Recommendations sounded premature. So we called them initially favored options to stress the idea that we really wanted people to think about these ideas. There was a lot of logic to them, but that we also still wanted to hear from the public about them. And we still were open to changing our mind. And sure enough, we did change our mind on a number of them, even though they were very good ideas initially.
So the favored options that we presented in the power of parking, they centered around recognizing the different locational characteristics of the city by establishing 5 different parking areas that were really based on the level of transit service that they receive with our Kingston Transit Express transit routes. So we established 5 different parking areas and established different minimum ratios within the different areas for the different uses. We proposed to reduce the minimums while still maintaining the supply of accessible parking spaces, created maximums for multi-unit residential, generalized and lowered the commercial minimums. And the intent of generalizing them was to really help to simplify tenant changes. So we often see, a restaurant has a different ratio than a retail store. So if you're in a commercial plaza and it changes tenants, there are often zoning issues with the change in tenancy in those properties. We propose to remove the minimums for designated heritage properties to help ensure heritage conservation and the maintenance of existing buildings on existing lots was at the forefront. Removing minimums for affordable housing proposals to ensure that the economics of it providing affordable housing is able to make sense and ensure that they aren't passing on unnecessary costs to those housing units. We were proposing to replace a cash in lieu of parking bylaw with an incentive for car share, which would be, a reduction in the minimum supply that's required. Establishing minimum long-term and short-term bike parking space requirements, requiring end-of-trip facilities in, employment and commercial uses. So that's shower and change room. So it actually makes it feasible for people to cycle to work. Added in flexibility in bike parking space dimensions. So not just requiring straight up horizontal bike spaces, but allowing percentages of those bike spaces to be vertical and stacked to ensure that the spaces can be provided in the most space efficient manner and still maintaining their functionality on the property, requiring that 5% of the bike spaces be for larger bikes, so cargo bikes and bike trailers and that type of larger cycling equipment, requiring that 10% of the bike spaces have bike lockers, so actually dedicated secured storage to ensure that people who are actually investing in really expensive bikes have the ability to secure their equipment and help to protect from bike theft, which we've obviously identified as a huge issue that really hurts cyclists and prevents them from cycling to specific destinations in the city. We added in incentives for enhanced bike spaces. So if you provide more larger bike spaces or e-bike plugins, more bike lockers, weather protection, maintenance areas, we were looking at that as an incentive. An incentive for EV ready spaces where you could reduce the minimum supply of required parking and to allow shared parking for different uses.
So there's 3 key things in that list. One, you see that while we're addressing vehicle parking, there are strategies there for all the alternatives to vehicle ownership: walking, biking, public transit, car share, because you can't just have a strategy that reduces the amount of parking if you're not making the alternatives to car use and ownership better through new strategies for that. So although this was a parking report, quote unquote, it contained from day one brand new strategies that were Ontario leading or even Canadian leading around walking, biking, transit, and car share. That's the first point. Second point is the first bullet is probably one of the most important strategic decisions we made, because for those of you who are following what other cities are doing with their parking regulations, you know it's quite common that cities are getting rid of their parking minimums. Just as a whole, no new parking minimums. And that is a very interesting and provocative and possibly quite strategic approach. And we considered that. We debated between either just getting rid of the minimums or reducing them substantially and using the rest of the parking requirements to leverage other things like car share. After a lot of discussion which is a city-specific discussion, we decided that the best thing to do was not just get rid of parking minimums, which would have been much easier, but rather reduce them substantially and use the remaining parking requirements as leverage for other things. A city that has a sophisticated approach can do that. You can do more than one thing with your parking regulations. Other cities who are not positioned to do those more specific things, you're probably better off just getting rid of your parking minimums. But I guarantee you, to the Sault Ste. Marie audience and to folks from any other municipality listening, your existing parking requirements are probably too high. The question is, what do you do about that? Do you get rid of them altogether, or do you reduce them and do other strategic things? That's a key conversation for every city to have. In Kingston, we ended up doing something different than many of the other cities out there. And then the last thing of the three that I mentioned was the parking maximums, because for those who may not understand this, just because you're getting rid of parking minimums doesn't mean you're actually getting less parking. You're just not necessarily regulating too much parking, requiring too much parking, but people can still overbuild parking, and with all the consequences of that. Enter parking maximums, which is the way you prevent overparking. And that's a separate but overlapping conversation with parking minimums. In Kingston, we did both, and we did both strategically to address our specific goals. That's a conversation that every other city needs to have. But don't just think about your parking minimums, think about the idea of parking maximums as well.
And as a follow-up, through the remainder of the process, so at our public meeting and for the next year through the new zoning bylaw, we continued to consult with the public. We heard feedback from a number of engaged citizens and developers and people who actually were really supportive of the work that we had done by and large. And we realized a number of things, having internal conversations about some of that feedback. So some of the things that we heard and realized through the process between the release of the power of parking and the final draft of the zoning bylaw was that, if we're already reducing the minimum so much and we have all of these incentives for car share and other things based off of the minimums, we might not ever realize those car share because, people might not actually uptake on those incentives if they actually want to provide the parking. So rather than using incentives for everything, could we move towards requirements where it's legally possible within the context of a zoning bylaw? We had heard some concerns from developers, specifically about the strict residential maximums that we had proposed. We had a maximum of one space per unit, in the downtown area and an area that was close to downtown. And there were also some concerns with requiring EV ready spaces with the current, the way that electrical load calculations are done with the design of buildings and the provision of EV charging stations. There are some significant challenges with that and the electrical infrastructure. We heard some feedback about keeping the cash in lieu and using that money for alternative modes of transportation, which we thought was a great idea. And then finally that, whatever the final approach is, that it should continue to be Kingston specific and reflect the neighborhood differences that we had initially reflected. So what we changed in the final draft of the zoning bylaw, after much consideration, we actually did change a number of things. So what you see in the power of parking is not actually what's in the final council approved zoning bylaw. We removed non-residential minimums altogether. We decided to get rid of the complication of those residential or non-residential minimums, which helped to change the way that we do accessible parking. So we had to create basically an effective ratio in order to continue to calculate accessible requirements. It allowed us to delete the shared parking component because there's no longer requirements for those non-residential spaces. We made car share required in multi-unit residential instead of being an incentive. So 5% of the multi-unit residential has to be for car share parking spaces. We decided to keep the cash in lieu of parking bylaw, update the dollar value that goes along with that, and redirect the money to alternative modes of transportation, and specifically the establishment of a broader car sharing network in Kingston, rather than directing that money to parking spaces, which is how it is currently being used. We changed the parking area map to actual walking routes. So we previously had like a 400-meter just like buffer that ignored where streets and sidewalks and the road network was, and really got our GIS team to do some detailed mapping to ensure that we're recognizing that, where people walk is really important, and it's looking at encouraging the creation of new walking routes through our policies as well, because we do have a complementary text-based policy that says where there's an actual walkway, we could also consider that. So if it isn't a current mapped walkway, we do have the ability to recognize that within the zoning framework. We added in the ability to exceed the residential maximums to a certain percentage if the extra spaces are EV ready and if additional car share parking spaces are provided. We added in the ability for 10% of the spaces to be compact cars, increase the percentages of the larger bike spaces, required the electrification of 10% of the bike spaces, required weather protection for short-term, 50% of the short-term bike spaces, and required maintenance areas for bikes where there are more than 25 bikes on a property.
So I know that's an awful lot to absorb, but I want the audience to understand the implications of those last three slides, because I'll tell you what usually happens in these kinds of processes. Cities may start off ambitious, but when the backlash happens, and often the backlash happens mostly from the private sector, then cities will back off at some level because they want to avoid appeals to the board, or it's just too controversial, particularly when you're trying to get your whole bylaw approved. It can be very easy to just back off. What Kingston did instead, and what we've been doing all the way through this exercise, is be intensely and unapologetically strategic. I think we listened to all the controversy, all of the concerns, and asked ourselves, what did we agree with? What did we not agree with? There were things that Laura and I learned through those complaints that we didn't know before, particularly around the challenges around electrification of vehicles, particularly. Laura knows more than that than any other person in the province now, I think. And because of that learning, we changed our strategy. And so as an example, car share went from being incentivized to being required, while at the same time, electric vehicles went from being required to be incentivized. Because as we listened, we learned and thought about the city's relative positioning to insist on something when there were problems and challenges involved. Or you'd have a strategy that might win some awards, but nobody would actually ever build it because you haven't thought practically. So we were intensely practical. We were intensely strategic. And the ultimate thing that resulted was not a strategy where the city backed off. Quite the opposite. I actually think the final version goes substantially farther than the original version and stands a much better chance of success. But we actually did also address some of the concerns while we were at it. But I wanted to say that because I give Kingston remarkable credit. It takes bravery in the face of opposition to still stick to your strategic vision, to constantly hold up that magic mirror of what are we actually trying to achieve, and will this actually achieve it for us or not? Instead of just being focused on who is mad, who is being the loudest in an election year, and just back off because it's too scary. I think Kingston has done a remarkable thing in terms of taking an incredibly ambitious piece of work in our first draft and going even further and more strategically effective in our second draft.
So as Brent said, what I think we achieved is we really did make a made in Kingston solution to parking. All of our considerations were very specific to the context of Kingston. And, it would have been a lot easier to just eliminate parking minimums altogether, but we would have lost a lot of opportunities to create that broader car share network and to really leverage the investments that we've made into active transportation and transit. We did get almost unanimous council approval at the meeting, a special meeting of council in April on the new zoning bylaw. There were no appeals on the parking section of the zoning bylaw to the Ontario Land Tribunal, which was a huge feat in of itself. We only had actually 2 parties appeal the entire zoning bylaw altogether. So we are expecting that the new zoning bylaw will be in effect very soon. Hopefully, fingers crossed, within the next month or so, we'll get some type of order from the Ontario Land Tribunal. Well, another thing that we've achieved is that through current development applications that are in progress under the existing zoning bylaws, we've really seen an uptake on, the standards that we've recommended through the new zoning bylaw from a parking and bike parking perspective, where, applicants are jumping on those ratios, and we're not requiring costly parking studies to be provided to support those through those redevelopment applications that are going under the existing zoning bylaws. And, we really are getting a lot of calls from other cities due to the progressive innovations where, it is a different conversation when we're not just talking about reducing or eliminating the minimums, but also adding in those innovative approaches to establishing other transit supportive approaches to parking. I would be remiss not to point to, some of the articles that have been published about the work since the approval. So obviously we had an article featured in Municipal World and on the Streets blog USA. I think this is Brent's favorite tagline, so I'll leave that to Brent to talk about.
Well, I said it's the best title I've ever read in an article, Steal This Idea, which is, and they were talking about, it was an American large city publication out of New York, basically saying that this small, by their standards, Canadian city was doing next generation parking reform. And I think they called it the most sophisticated parking approach in North America. And that can be an insult. Sophisticated, something can be overly sophisticated, but they meant it as a compliment in the sense of connecting the specific things we did and the specific strategies we were trying to achieve. So I definitely hope many cities steal this idea. Not verbatim, to be clear, not verbatim, because everything we did was in the context of the strategic positioning of Kingston. So I do not think it would be replicatable in its entirety. You would have to sort of replicate our process. You would have to replicate our thought process, and also frankly, the changing culture that we've been working on in Kingston, which is kind of a necessary precondition. Because if you're not willing to think out of the box and think creatively, then you can't get to where Kingston got. So I'm gonna do this last slide and then we're gonna stop. But I wanted to just, as the outsider, I'm not really an outsider in Kingston's context. I'm kind of like an extension of staff at this point. But from the perspective of someone who works across the country and across the world, this is what I would say about the work. And I do believe that it is the most sophisticated parking strategy I've seen in certainly any North American city. It's a very successful model for cities of any size. And there is this notion that small to medium-sized cities can't do parking innovation. That's a big city thing, and that's just fundamentally wrong. Cities of any size can follow this model of approach, of starting a very different conversation. First of all, I truly do believe, and this is what led our work, that you have to change the conversation while you're changing the approach. Because if you don't change the conversation, the old conversation will kill you. if you're ready to be honest and brave about parking and your city goals, there are some things you will read in that power of parking document that would probably make a lot of municipal planners and municipal politicians squirm in their seats, because there is a level of candor and honesty there that most planning documents don't have. And if you're not willing to tell the truth about the real reasons why we're having a fundamentally different conversation about parking, then you're not going to get there. The same approach can be used with many other planning tools and issues. We're already now, Laura, talking about it in the context of the new official plan, of the new, of almost every planning exercise we can do at the City of Kingston, and use that same approach of a different kind of a conversation, a different attitude towards bravery and bluntness, and how to get to that better answer quicker and with no appeals, hopefully again. So it's transferable as a thought process. It's not transferable as a bunch of specific tools and answers, but it is transferable as an approach. It's transferable as a culture. This I want to stress. There's nothing in Kingston that makes this easier in Kingston than it is in your city of Sault Ste. Marie, because trust me, I work all over the country and I'm used to people saying, well, Kingston is different. Don't they know that Sault Ste. Marie is very different? There is nothing in Kingston that made this an easier conversation. As a matter of fact, I think we started, Laura, and Paige, the commissioner, started saying Kingston is a very conservative place. Kingston doesn't really like change. And we were talking about something that is just as controversial in Kingston as any other city in North America. So the fact that we had this success was not based on it being easy. It was based on us doing a good job and doing a different kind of job in terms of the strategy than most city halls, frankly, do. It has significantly supported and reinforced a new city planning culture and confidence in Kingston. This came in a few years after we had been working on changing the culture and approach on planning. And we had already had a couple of years of success in that changing culture and approach. So we were building on the confidence that we already had in that success. But Laura, I think it's fair to say that with the remarkable success of the parking piece, particularly the zoning bylaw in its entirety, but particularly the parking piece because of how controversial parking usually is, it's given the community, it's given council, it's given the planning department an even higher level of confidence. It's positioned the planning department and the transportation department with a high level of credibility going forward as we go into the official plan. And that's something that most city halls would kill to have, that level of confidence and credibility. And that's really important and incredible result of success. It takes real leadership. Laura's boss and Laura's boss's boss fully supported the boldness that we wanted to do here. As a matter of fact, Paige, her boss, is probably one of the boldest leaders I've worked with anywhere in Canada. And it takes that kind of interest and willingness to recognize when your tools are failing and fundamentally want to do it differently, a strong wish to do things better. And lastly, I'm a big fan of what I call the unlikely hero cities, the cities that you don't expect, because we're all impressed by the Copenhagens and the Parises and the New Yorks and such. But during the pandemic, we saw unlikely heroes doing remarkable things. Cities like Oakland, California, being one of the leaders in closing streets to cars and opening them to people, for example. Kingston has already become an unlikely inspiration, a city that most cities haven't heard of before, but is suddenly on the radar screen in terms of innovation and a different innovative way of thinking. It's not based on what the size of your city is, the size of your city staff is. It's all based on a strong interest in not accepting the status quo, not accepting the failure you've had in previous years, and fundamentally saying we're going to do something different and we're going to be brave about it. If Kingston can do it, the Sioux can do it. If Kingston can do it, anybody can do it. So I think we'll end there. Laura, did you have a last slide?
Nope, that's it.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Brent, so much. So we are just going to dive into our questions right now. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'll go ahead and read them. So our first question is, did you find any advantages to parking discouragement policies, like getting rid of free parking in favor of paid parking spaces or greater parking enforcement, whether from a GHG emission reduction or active alternative transportation adoption perspective?
I'll jump in here and say absolutely. I think, we did a lot of research on parking literature, and there is a direct connection between discouraging free parking, whether it be public supply of parking on street versus parking within, a free parking lot. When parking is priced in a way that makes people think twice about whether they're going to use their car to get there, it helps to discourage it. And when that route is also supported by transit or active transportation, all the better, because they can use those alternative modes.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, next question. What do you say to merchants in our downtown Main Street who believe that the success of their business is ample free parking close to the door, curbside or otherwise?
Brent, do you want to take that one?
Well, one of the important things to point out, and this was a shock to some people when we were talking about the power of parking, is there's a certain category of parking we weren't talking about. And we start off by saying, we're not talking about this. We're not talking about municipal parking on the main street or in the municipal parking structures, whether how much exists and how much we charge. That was a separate exercise that's going to be, frankly, it's going to use a lot of the momentum of this conversation, but it wasn't part of this work program because that's not governed by the zoning bylaw. We had a really pragmatic reason for not talking about that, because this was about parking regulations as a component of Laura's new zoning bylaw. For the conversations with the Main Street about, do you have free parking? Do you have ample on-street parking for the stores and restaurants? That's a conversation that's going to happen moving forward. But the retailers in the downtown were on side with the things we were doing in terms of privately owned parking, because if we could reduce the parking requirement and make it, frankly, housing easier to build in and around our downtown, that's a good thing for downtown, because we wanted to get as much housing built as a major catalyst for downtown strength, downtown revitalization, because downtown Kingston has been struggling. So they recognized that given that we weren't talking about the on-street parking, we were talking about the private sector parking, and this would provide additional flexibility that would help get new housing in and around the downtown built. The downtown retailers and restaurants were, I think, am I overstating it that they were fully on side, Laura? But they did not come out in opposition to anything we were talking about. Did I miss anything, Laura?
Nope, you got it.
Okay, I'm just going to breeze along here. Next question. How would you respond to the challenge that a place like Sault Ste. Marie has too much snow, is too cold to attempt to reduce parking and scale up active transportation and transit uptake?
I'll tackle that. I haven't been to the Soo in a long time. And so I never tell a city that I have not gotten to know very well what they should do. But I will say this, I often, when I start in a city, I start off with a message that says, I'm very sure I'm going to hear the 8 most unhelpful words in the English language relatively quickly in this conversation. We could never do that in our city. And it's amazing how much excuse gets built into the conversation. In almost every city I have, you can replace snow with hills, snow with sunshine, amount of regulation, the province or state that's involved, whatever the excuse is. And literally I work all over the world, so the excuses vary greatly. But what I have found is it's not about the snow. It's not about the sun in hot cities that I work in. It's not about the rules or regulations. It's not about the budget. It's about the culture. 100%. The cities that are doing remarkable things have a different culture around innovation, and they will work with the details of the local area, including snow storage. And guess what, by the way, Kingston has snow. Kingston has a fair amount of snow. This is not something unique to the Soo. So you work with the existing challenges and conditions. Most of the parking we're talking about in this context is underground parking, which is not related to snow storage, but it does affect things like commercial parking, for example. But we work that in. That's part of the strategy. Those are the local conditions that become part of the strategy. What I have no tolerance for is the lazy excuse Because in my work all over the cities, it's that lazy culture of excuse instead of a culture of opportunity innovation that literally makes the difference between successful cities and unsuccessful cities.
Thanks, Brent. So we are at time. I'll ask Brent and Laura, do you have a few moments to answer maybe one or two more? Sure. You do? Okay, so for those in attendance, I understand if you need to peace out, but we're just going to continue along here due to the generosity of our guests and their time. Okay, next question. You've created a bylaw which requires car sharing, reduced parking, and makes transit more efficient through the establishment of parking zones. But what exactly does this new bylaw affect?
I'll take that one on. Zoning bylaws regulate every private property in the city. So the land uses that are permitted, the buildings that can be built. So when we're talking about parking policies connected to a zoning bylaw, it means that anytime anyone wants to redevelop their property, to build an addition on their building, to change the use from a residential use to a commercial use, or add new residential units, or basically do anything with their properties, the zoning bylaw regulates that. So the parking provisions, the bike parking requirements, the loading space requirements in the zoning bylaw, everything applies to every development and redevelopment of every property. So it really is a connection to the growth and the future of the city.
Can I try to add a thing that might get to a strategic part of the question? Because Laura's covered the factual part of the answer. That's what a zoning bylaw does. But when the question was asked is what will I sort of took from the question, what will it really do? And a good example of that is the question of getting rid of your parking minimums. A lot of cities out there, and good friends of mine, chief planners who are friends of mine, are very proud of the fact they're getting rid of parking minimums. And it's really important, because if you're going to have too much parking, the worst case scenario is you have too much parking because the city forced developers or homeowners to build it. If you're going to have too much parking, it should at least not be because the government made it illegal to do any less parking. So I often say the first thing to do is for the municipalities to make sure it's not their fault that there's too much parking. But when you ask the question, what will this really do? We had to keep reminding people that just getting rid of parking minimums doesn't mean you're going to have less parking. It won't necessarily result in that. And a great example are commercial sites where, frankly, even though the parking regulations were too high for shopping malls, developers were routinely building even more than the parking minimum because of what their tenants thought they would need, or just because they thought, oh, it's cheap land, I'm going to build as much parking as possible because I'm going to design for Black Friday and Boxing Day. So just getting rid of your parking minimums does not achieve less parking. It just prevents, it just takes away the municipality forcing too much parking, if you see what I mean. But if you want to have a conversation, if your actual goal is to say, I want less parking because we are overbuilding parking, then you have to have the conversation about parking maximums, which actually can be more controversial. And early in our process, we decided, because we were in a pandemic, we were not going to establish parking maximums for commercial sites, for shopping malls, even though, as I said, shopping malls are some of the worst players in overbuilding parking. Why? Because at that moment, we were in a pandemic, commercial operations were struggling. We were very nervous about doing something that would be seen as a major negative to the commercial industry right at the beginning of the pandemic, when people were very concerned about impact on retailing. So, but we telegraphed that we were going to have that conversation later, just not right now in the pandemic. But what we did do is get rid of the minimums. So, I give that example. I give that example as to answer the question that I read into the question you were asked, which is, what will this really do? What will this really regulate? The answer is, if you want your zoning bylaw to be a strategic document, a smart document, instead of a kind of a dumb, blunt instrument, which is what most zoning bylaws are, you have to really think about what you want to achieve, whether your zoning bylaws are going to achieve that or not, or have a chance to achieve it. What's missing in the context of something that isn't there yet, like a parking maximum? because zoning bylaws can be incredibly smart and strategic things. We just haven't necessarily built them that way.
So I'm just going to ask 2 more questions. We're not going to have time for them all. So everyone will have my email who attended this. And if you want to follow up with me, I'd be happy to follow up with our guests separately. So second last question, realizing this is new, are there any important or significant results that you can credit your new policies for that you're seeing already? And do you have an overall high level goal or goals from your strategy?
I think I'll jump in here first, and Brent, obviously feel free to add anything else, but I think, our policies aren't even in effect yet. So it's really hard to see the results of it. There were 2 appeals. So technically the new zoning bylaw isn't in force and effect. So it's not something that we've seen in practice yet. We have had a number of people who have contacted me and basically asked me to let them know when the new zoning bylaw is in effect, because they benefit so much from the provisions that we built into the new zoning bylaw from a parking perspective. I think the way that we've seen development applications that are in process really uptake on, providing way more bike parking than we've ever seen before, because they realize that we will support less regular car parking if they provide more bike parking, I think has been the most satisfying element that I've seen through the work. It's pretty new that we are seeing a direct impact on supporting cycling infrastructure on private properties in the city already. Overall high level goals or goals from the strategy, I think, is really to ensure that we are making active transportation, transit, car share, really viable alternatives to the car, and to help to create a more successful system in Kingston, because, it is a city that is very car oriented and has been developed in a car oriented way. And we're really trying to change the approach to the way that the city develops. And I think that the number one goal from my perspective is to see that realized.
One of the downsides of a small city, notwithstanding the leadership and innovation in Kingston, it's still a relatively small staff. And so what larger cities are able to do is create monitoring programs where they, will establish definitions of success and monitor, provide reports every year or 2 to say, here's what we're seeing. I think Kingston wants to do that, but like everything else Kingston wants to do, we'll be doing it off the side of the desk, right? And doing our best in terms of keeping track of things. But 2 things I'll say to start. One, the definition of success. We established definitions of success, but it's not as simple as less parking, because the actual that's just a symptom, or that's just an indicator. The real definition of success is more multifamily housing being built with less parking, but because with less parking, it makes it easier to build it. So we actually get it built. And the price point comes down because we're concerned about rental prices and ownership prices. Price point comes down, so housing affordability improves. Heritage projects are rehabilitated and reused because we remove the parking requirement for heritage buildings, because often you couldn't change the use or rehabilitate the building because it would kick in new parking requirements that you literally couldn't fit on the heritage site. So a definition of success is more heritage restoration being done. That's where you start to see, again, the spin-off effects. Once you've embraced the idea of everything that parking does, your definitions of success are much broader than just less parking being built. And that's the second thing I'll say is sort of in kin with that. Although Laura's right that the parking rules are not enforced yet, although they will be shortly. They're already being used to negotiate rezonings because the city has already telegraphed that that's what the city wants, so they can become the basis of negotiations on site-specific applications. But most important thing I say is we changed the conversation about parking. We invested time, and not a lot of time, frankly. We didn't take years, we took months. And we invested that time in changing the conversation about parking because we wanted that change to pay dividends in every conversation we had moving forward. And, it'll be interesting to see if we have to redo that conversation every few years because, communities forget maybe. But I think our theory has been that investment in a fundamentally different understanding on the part of the public on what parking really means and that you can't have a serious conversation about climate change mitigation and affordability without changing parking. That's going to pay a lot of dividends in almost every conversation City Hall has moving forward. And to me, that really was the first definition of success, the first thing that we wanted to achieve. And I think we're already seeing that. We're already seeing that the conversations have changed. I'm not on the ground like Laura is, but I think that's true.
Awesome. So we're going to end it there. We're 10 minutes over. I've taken note of the questions that we haven't answered, and I will reach out to our speakers to see if they can give us a couple of bullet points, and I will share that with the recording. So once again, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Brent, very much. So insightful, very inspiring, and very innovative, truly. So on behalf of the Environmental Sustainability Committee and the City of Sault Ste. Marie Planning Department, thank you so much for your time.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.